by way of a briefer preamble, but they expanded a bit, and I hope to good effect. And then we will hear Robert Frost himself, thanks to the marvels of YouTube and tape recording. We'll hear him recite his own poem, Two Tramps in Mud Time. I will instigate a discussion of that poem with a few remarks, and then we'll break up into maybe 3 breakout rooms where you can see what you think and articulate reactions. And I think Manisha can arrange to have the poem kind of there at your disposal to look at. And then I very much look forward to further illumination, seeing what you make of it. And then we'll do the same for a Wallace Stevens poem, The Man on the Dump. And if there's time, I have some things to begin to say about the much larger Wallace Stevens poem, An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. Okay. So I start by taking a phrase, an important notion behind this series, obliquity, obliquities, namely the notion of dissolving the presumed separation between the arts and the sciences. I think this is a very good thing, and I take it as given that you all do as well, that if you didn't think this was a good thing, be hard pressed to understand why you would be here this evening. Now I wanted to put the point, or at least a point, in a nice pithy way, a brief compass, and part of why these remarks will go on a little bit is that I couldn't quite do it, in particular on the art side of things. So here's a starting point about science. Why do we have it? We have it, I think, because we can figure things out. And that's a very good thing, because at the most basic or elemental level, we have to figure out certain indispensable things, or we perish. To bring science, as I understand it, properly into focus, we need to add that we're able not only to figure out what we need to figure out on pain of some kind of imminent peril, but what we choose to figure out for the sheer dedication to and delight in exercising our capacity, our powers of inquiry, of looking into the world and understanding how it works. Now, why do we have art? And in particular, poetry. Already, that actually is a somewhat more of a stumper of a question. Perhaps, in the case of poetry, we might seek a parallel with our ability to figure things out simply in our ability to speak. And so in particular, our ability to speak not only about what must be addressed in order to escape danger, secure comfort, some such, but parallel to the dedication to and delight in our powers of inquiry, dedication to and delight in our powers of speech. Um, Indeed, I was reminded here of the justly famous passage from the end of William Carlos Williams's poem, Asphodel, That Greeny Flower, um, that goes as follows. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Um, there's a bit of irony here in that, as I'll explain in a bit, at first I thought that this poem would figure centrally in the evening, but it got consigned to the cutting room floor late in the day. Now, I mean, that's already a bit longer than the putting the point briefly and succinctly that I was hoping for. And I think that an important part of the reason is that when we're addressing the presumed, but I think factitious, and I, as I say, I'm counting on all you agreeing that it's factitious, the presumed, quote, separation between the arts and the sciences. There's two tasks. There's the avowed task of obliquities of dissolving, overcoming, transcending, superseding, or something like that. But I think, secondly, there's the task of understanding how any really intelligent, vigorous, serious human being could have thought that there was such a noxious separation in the first place. Seems to me that when you think about it, the idea that there should be any kind of tension or forced choice between the arts and the sciences, it makes about as much sense as presuming there's some kind of tension or forced choice between noodles and potatoes, or canoes and sailboats. In all cases, we have things that are different, but fairly evidently, I think, speaking to a clear and important need: sustenance, the potatoes and the noodles; marine travel, the canoes and the sailboats. It does bring things to a head when you say, well, what is the corresponding need or sort of service, if you like, that the arts and the sciences provide for us. And there, I think, it's perhaps misleading to speak of a clear and important need. I think the point is it's important, but exactly what it is and how to characterize it is not at all clear. At a best guess for the moment, I will simply say that we might say it's the task of being human. That's the first round of preliminary observations I have, setting the stage for our look at the poems. And now a second point to take you through how I came to choose the poems I did. It's striking that the idea of me, a philosophy professor, talking about poetry must have come from conversation, perhaps also from my having read some of Manisha's poems after I taught her, talked with her about them, knowing it was important to her, and it's long been important to me, but it is worth emphasizing that I'm wandering outside any strictly professional competence, though doing so very happily, and I'll talk about why in a minute. But when I thought about poetry in this context, medical school, humanities and sciences workshop, I immediately thought of the doctor poet, William Carlos Williams. And that got me thinking in general about poets that have other occupations. For example, Wallace Stevens, who was an executive at an insurance company. And I realize that I have skipped over something I need to say, which is that Manisha will put into the chat a link to this ASHA, that is the acronym for the Arts and Science Honors Academy, a very, to me, very important and rewarding undergraduate program at the University of Calgary that I've been involved with for close to 2 decades now. And it was in the first year course that I taught Manisha, and we've kept in touch since. Okay, so Wallace Stevens came to mind, as I said, hard on the heels of Carlos Williams. And in the meantime, I had come across the Frost poem, which actually addresses square on these issues, signaled in my title, Avocation, Vocation, Profession. Fun factoids about Carlos Williams and Stevens. At least if Google is to be trusted, or Wikipedia, or wherever they came up, that William Carlos Williams didn't just have a thriving career as a physician, but wrote a textbook, or possibly even a work of medical research. So he was very committed to his medical life, in addition, of course, to his poetry. And Stevens, when he really had hit it big and won Pulitzer Prizes and things, not long before he died in the mid-50s, Harvard called up and said, would you like to have a chair in poetry? When it became apparent that he would have to give up the vice presidency of the Hartford Insurance Company, he said, no thanks. I thought that was quite delightful. Okay, so now I am going to do a little bit of conceptual organizing that it'd be nice if I'd actually typed it up, because it's a matter of different contrasts. But here goes. So in my title, Avocation and Vocation belong together. I'll be talking about more about them in a bit. Profession belongs to a different register, and a companion to it, roughly, as avocation is to vocation, it seems to me, you might say career is to profession. And when we start to think about things in that way, some interesting things result. Because as soon as you speak of career, it seems to me, you have another contrast in this neck of the woods, the difference between a career and a mere job. And the OED on career is pretty fascinating. Some of you may know, it wasn't news to me, that career as a verb means to sort of race around. And indeed, that is the origin of the thing. As a noun, the first meaning is the ground on which a race is run, a race course, right? And by extension, any kind of running course, and by extension to that, a person's progress or course through life. And the core notions here, for example, meaning 5a, a person's course or progress through life or a distinct portion, especially when publicly conspicuous or abounding in remarkable incidents. And also especially with a notion of advancement, right? It's that distinguishes a career from a mere job. So it seems to me that with regard to the notion of a profession, we have three distinct contrasts that are worth bringing into focus when we talk about poetry and poets. So let me kind of remind you what got me started on this line of very general thinking. It was the striking idea that of the three poets I thought I was going to talk about, only going to talk about two, one came to mind precisely because of his profession, a doctor, what I take it a great many of you here are studying to be or already are, a medical doctor, that is. Not a sort of oldie-fashioned doctor like me of philosophy. Right, and then Stevens, insurance executive, whereas Frost did make his living as a poet. He was a very well-known, and he was a professional poet in that way. So that's the background, and it seems to me then we have a first contrast simply between being paid to do something and not doing it without material compensation. And there's actually a number of different sort of notions and concepts that we have if you do something for which you're not paid. One very natural one is amateur, though of course that in its etymological sense is really quite different from anything involving money. It means doing something for the love of it. Another is volunteer, and I think there are probably others, but there's one contrast between being paid and not, and according, notice on that, job and career belong together. They're things you do for material compensation. Another is working at a recognized profession, like lawyer, doctor, university professor, versus working at something else. In the old days, I used to often have to sign students and friends and acquaintances passport applications because you weren't eligible to do that, as I think you now are, just in virtue of being another Canadian citizen. You had to be a professional of some sort. The thought presumably being that then you had a stake, given the integrity of your profession, to avoid corruption apart from your own moral character, or somehow buttressing your own moral character. So working at a profession, being a professional in that sense versus working at something else, and there a job is not tantamount to a profession. A profession is a job in some sense of being paid, but not in this sense. And then, of course, connected, we have a raft of senses in which professional means doing something to a very high, clearly defined professional standard, right? It's a honorific notion. And of course, to suggest that that's the sense in which we have in mind when we say Frost was a professional poet, but Stevens wasn't, would be a travesty, right? Okay, so far on the profession side of it. Now, vocation and avocation, the OED is also interesting on, particularly on avocation. Because the more I think about it, I think in the Frost poem we're going to look at, he is giving it a particular cast or flavor that that commands attention. Well, if we start with the notion of a vocation, to have a vocation is to experience yourself as being called to do something with your life, not just for a brief period. So the essential distinction there is between having a vocation and not having one, and exactly what counts as having one is far from, they're far from sort of agreed upon standards as there might be in all three of my senses of professional. You could have different views on the question of how many people, as a rule, really do have a vocation in this sense at all. And then the avocation. Well, avocation turns out originally to be a pejorative, to be the condition of being called away or having your attention diverted, distraction, right? It's got the same Latin root, vocare, to call, same root as voice, but originally it means a being taken away. You might, as just for the matter, think of it that probably the most commonly used word in this family with that root, of course, is advocate, which is a calling to, calling for, right? Supporting, calling on behalf of. But here, look down at the bottom of the fine print of the OED, and you're told that it's not yet been fully updated. It was first published in 1885, because it's at A, right? The Oxford English Dictionary was published over many decades, starting with A. And you can tell that when you look at sense 4, because of how firm they are about English usage. But as in many cases, the business which called away was one of equal or greater importance, the new meaning was improperly foisted upon the word and came to mean ordinary employment or a vocation. So the fifth contrast, just to kind of remind you to rehearse, I've got three contrasts involving professional, paid versus not paid, having a recognized profession versus working at something else, and being professional in an honorific sense, being particularly skilled, good, to the, roughly, whether you're paid or not, you're sort of worthy of being paid if you do something to a professional standard. And then we have vocation, where that's a very deep notion, very naturally connected to divinities or muses or something like that, something in some way quasi-external to you that calls you to do something versus not having such. And then the last one is something like, when you have a vocation, I take it to be a subcategory of having a vocation. When you have a vocation, you might have an avocation alongside your vocation, or you might be more single-minded or something like that. Okay. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Okay, it's about half hour in, right? So Manisha, why don't we have Frost read his Two Tramps in Mud Time? You'll see the what was, those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the poem before, will see what was provoking that train of thought when you hear the last stanza. And then I'll talk about it for a bit, and then you guys will talk about it for a bit.
All right, perfect. I will get this started here.
Two Tramps in Mud Time. Out of the mud, two strangers came and caught me splitting wood in the yard, and one of them put me off my aim by hailing cheerily, "Hit them hard." I knew pretty well why he dropped behind and let the other go on away. I knew pretty well what he had in mind. He wanted to take my job for pay. Good blocks of oak it was I split, as large around as the chopping block, and every piece I squarely hit fell splinterless as a cloven rock. The blows that a life of self-control spares to strike for the common good, that day giving a loose to my soul I spent on the unimportant wood. The sun was warm, but the wind was chill. You know how it is with an April day, when the sun is out and the wind is still. You're 1 month on in the middle of May. But if you so much as dare to speak, a cloud comes over the sunlit arch, a wind comes off a frozen peak, and you're 2 months back in the middle of March. A bluebird comes tenderly up to a light and turns to the wind to unruffle a plume, his song so pitched as not to excite a single flower as yet to bloom. It is snowing a flake, and he half knew winter was only playing possum, except in color he isn't blue, but he wouldn't advise a thing to blossom. The time when most I loved my task, these two must make me love it more by coming with what they came to ask. You'd think I never had felt before the weight of an axe head poised aloft, the grip on earth of outspread feet, the life of muscles rocking soft and smooth and moist in vernal heat. Out of the woods, two hulking tramps from sleeping God knows where last night, but not long since in the lumber camps. They thought all chopping was theirs of right. Men of the woods and lumberjacks, they judged me by their appropriate tool. Except as a fellow handled an axe, they had no way of knowing a fool. Nothing on either side was said. They knew they had but to stay their stay, and all their logic would fill my head, as that I had no right to play with what was another man's work for gain. My right might be love, but theirs was need, and where the two exist in twain, theirs was the better right, agreed. But yield who will to their separation, My object in living is to unite my avocation and my vocation as my two eyes make one in sight. Only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done for heaven and the future's sakes.
There we go. Thank you, Manisha. Fun to hear him stumble a little bit over his own poem there. All right, so I'm going to tell you how I came across this poem, and then just throw out some of the things that have come to my mind by way of questions that you might address in the breakout groups. And then, as I say, I very much look forward to a discussion about it. So a dear friend and mentor of mine was writing an article on philosophy as a vocation. It was an article that was very critical of the current state of academic philosophy as a profession. And she was reading, I forget the name of the author, nothing sort of terribly august, a kind of relaxing novel. She's happy to describe herself as not ashamed of reading trash, quote, trash novels. And it's called Mortal Stakes. So it had taken the title from that lovely line, when work is play for mortal stakes. So she found the passage and thought it was so perfect as an epigraph for her paper. And it's a great example of how powerful poetry can be. She just had to call me up and say, you won't believe the wonderful stanza I've just found that's so perfect for my paper. And indeed, I agree. So one thing I want to do, just because it gave me, when I started to look at it closely, it tripped me up a little bit, and that is, it was an expression that some of you may well know, but that I didn't. It's in the second stanza. That day, giving a loose my soul. That was not in my vocabulary, that idiom, but it simply means to give a loose to something or somebody is to allow unrestrained freedom or laxity, give full vent to feelings free from restraint, and so forth. I think that's at least that's the only one that I have now, to just make sure we understand the words on the page, what's being said. I'm interested in different ways of dividing it up. And I'll just cut to the chase and say, when I first read it, I thought, yeah, that's kind of a nice little story, but boy, is it all just building up to the punchline. So that final stanza is where we're heading. The rest, maybe not à la hauteur, comme disent the French say, not quite. I think they're, on more careful reading, I think there is a lot going on, and you can divide it up in different ways. You can divide it up as to when the strangers are involved, when they're not. I note that the title is almost a little deceptive, Two Tramps in Mud Tub, but it's really about the narrator poet. That's the continuing voice in the thing. What are all those birds doing in the middle of it? And then just, a few hours ago, as I had to, put thoughts onto paper, I thought, well, what is this avocation? Is it splitting wood? Is that the avocation? I take it that poetry is the vocation. What is the deed? What is the deed in that final stanza, right? Only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done. for the matter of that, if we're picking nits, today I thought, I think that for heaven and the future's sakes, I think that's just there because of his formal scheme. I think it would be stronger just to end on, is the deed ever really done? What do you guys think? So, what is the deed? Oh, there we are. I hope I've said enough. So Manisha, maybe 3 groups with the number we've got. And my thought was that each group might want to nominate at least one spokesman, but I mean, everybody can get a word in edgewise, and maybe 8, 9, 10 minutes to think about it, talk about it, come up with your thoughts, things that you noticed that I haven't mentioned, and I, as I say, look forward to hearing what you come up with, and we'll pick up, kibitz along, and then we'll just see how the time is going, and we'll do the same thing with the Stevens, except that we will get not Wallace Stevens, but Manisha Varadia reading the poem.
This will test my powers of short-term memory as much as my powers of eloquence. Gee, what did we talk about? Well, we did, I guess for one, we noticed that there seemed to be 2 thematic strands at play in the poem. Mm-hmm. The one having to do with the speaker's pursuit of his task.
Yeah.
And the interruption of that task by these 2 antagonists, right? Who wander onto the scene, as it were.
Yeah.
But we also noticed and felt that in some ways it was almost as important. There was this other strand that had to do with the transition from one season to another.
Yes.
And that seemed to seasonally allegorize something that's pervasive, I think, and we thought in Frost poetry, and that's the moment of pause. We might, using a philosophical term, even say epoche, that is antecedent to a moment of revelation. What we couldn't figure out was how these 2 strands actually intersect. What is the significance of this story of seasonal change to this other story about vocation? However, one of us, Timber, I think had a really interesting suggestion with respect to that, insofar as he observed that Frost was not the only one at work in this poem. There was also the bird. The landscape wasn't inert, right? Something else, another creature was going about its business.
Yeah.
We wondered if there might be clues to our understanding what the mortal stakes are for Frost by looking more closely at the bird that withholds its song and seems like the speaker in the poem to be sentient of the fragility of this liminal moment between 2 places. Yeah. What else? And then there was also this issue of the title. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the kind of obliqueness of it with respect to the subject matter of the poem. Mm-hmm. And one of the phrases in the poem, in fact, I expressed a wish that Frost had titled the poem Mortal Stakes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I had a thought, which, like the title, was a bit oblique, and that was, I was reminded of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan in his reading of Hamlet. He talks about the duel at the end of Hamlet. And he says that for Hamlet, the stakes are elsewhere. Claudius is placing bets, other people are placing bets, but Hamlet's not there. He's playing out some other metaphysical drama when he enters the duel. And it seems to me that maybe there's something like that in the idea of vocation that haunts this poem. That, you know, you're going about this very mundane task, but you bring yourself to the task with a spirit that places you and the task both right here and somewhere else. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Wow, lots there. I think we need to hear from the other groups. Don't be intimidated. Andrew's an old friend, and he's deeply immersed in all this material. We had another couple of groups, didn't we, Manisha? Any other?
Yes. Group 2 or 3, go ahead. We can try and go in order. That'll probably save us some time. So we'll go group 2 next.
I don't even remember what our number was.
Yeah, who's group 2?
Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, so Suzanne, you're a part of group 2. So whoever your spokesperson is.
You're the spokesperson.
I just
Ooh.
mundane task. I kind of felt a bristling when you said that. I just stopped my video because I think it's affecting because of my internet. But
I can hear.
I kind of felt okay. And I think it's because when I read the poem, I didn't feel that it was a mundane task to him. I felt that I felt like the wood chopping was his vocation. And then along came these two tramps who saw it as a vocation and paid work. He was reluctant to give up something that the two tramps would see as unnecessary for him to do. And in this season, it was absolutely vital to him. And so he was reluctant.
Nice. Okay. I think that when we've heard from the last group, I think it's definitely worth thinking about that notion of mundane, what it brings with it, and how it fits with the vocation and the avocation. Thanks. Last group. Anybody from there? There were 3, weren't there, Manisha?
Yes, the last group, if I'm remembering, I think Cheryl was a part of the last group. Is that right?
Sure. I'll start, and then I hope Sarah and Avocation can add in what we had talked about. I think there seemed to be, as we discussed it, this sort of tension between hanging on to this avocation that seemed to be so meaningful for this person, but perhaps having some doubt about it when these two people came and in his own mind began to wonder, perhaps this is something that should be let go of, because this was really not a need. This was really something he was doing for sheer pleasure. And that ability to be in the zone, if we call it that, or a sense of timelessness as he was taking in all of these incredible parts of the experience with the bluebird and the day and so on. But at the end of the poem, he seems to resolve that by saying, you know, that my object in living is to unite, and my avocation and my vocation is to unite my avocation, my vocation, as my two eyes make one in sight. It was almost as if he could not live or be able to express himself or be himself without having both. And I think we talked a lot about this maybe tension we sometimes feel within our own professions about expressing the artistic piece part of our world versus the scientific part, and not always being able to have a place to be able to express it. Certainly the artistic component of our careers, sometimes we don't have maybe as much permission as we might like. But that was just some of the ideas. But Sarah and Avocation, did you want to add some things as well?
I think you totally covered it. Something else we kind of brought up as well was like this sort of tension that we're experiencing between creativity and quote unquote scientific professions is really imposed by others. Like when he saw the other people in the forest, that's when the uncertainty started to begin. It wasn't as if it was this internal thing for him. It was because other people around him were kind of pushing him in that direction.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's terrific. So, thinking of time minutia, we're just about halfway through. Is that right? I mean, we want to wrap it up around the hour mark.
Yes, around 8 o'clock would be great.
Around 8 o'clock. Yeah. But I do think it'd be worth, seeing if we can put our heads together a little bit here. I think it's a nice observation, Andy, that the title brings those two themes. There's the two traps and there's the mud time. There's a strong tendency and impression to think that it's really about the avocation and the vocation and the meaningfulness. So why does he choose that title? I think that's a good question, and I think one can pick up on the observation. I forget whose it was that it's the narrator is only brought to make that eloquent final statement by having to think about it, by being disturbed and disrupted from just the being in the zone. I'm struck by the fact that I very casually said I assume the vocation is poetry. That's, of course, building in that we know it's a poem by Robert Frost, or perhaps build in that we know that it's a poem, but yes, not just what is the avocation, but what is the vocation here. It occurs to me that there is perhaps a pretty precise narrative, a reason within the narrative for why the sun is warm and the wind is chill. It's April, it's spring. We're just I think because of the coming down from the lumber camps, right? That must have something to do with their seasonal occupation, right? So that they would arrive. But let's maybe talk about the task and what it is to be a mundane or ordinary experience. I think I might be able to tie this into Stevens at the end. But was it Suzanne? Was it you that talked about the mundane experience? Is that right? And the idea. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and just when he said that word mundane, yes, it just made me perk up and think about the poem a little bit more.
Yeah. I think that's. I think it's a good, word and notion to think about it, because one reason one might well bristle, I think, at the idea that it's, quote, just a mundane task. Is the sense in which calling something a mundane task can veer in the direction of calling it a menial task. And that carries distinctly pejorative connotations of not the sort of thing that any sensible person would do if they didn't have to, or for its own sake, or unless they were paid, right? That's what menial jobs are all about. And so Frost he's picked something, now the second stanza really comes alive, I think, in a way, doesn't it? It's a very simple task. It's manual labor in the literal sense, nothing else but the work of the hands. But the great pride and skill, it's almost a bit too much to be believed that he's cleaving these oak blocks that are as big as the chopping block, just Paul Bunyan-like, cleaving them like a rock. But that's, perhaps deliberate to bring out the way something very simple can be as meaningful as anything in life, I suppose. Right? I mean, I think that's perhaps one nice. Andy, you're muted.
Am I unmuted now?
No, you're unmuted now.
Okay. I just wanted to say too that I think there's something that's useful to think about that in this, in terms of, Frost's own professional biography, if we can call it that, that goes, alongside the fact that, as you notice, Mark, his poetry was his profession. And that is the way he practiced poetry. Poetry, Frost was famous for eschewing free verse, and for saying that for him, writing poetry in free verse was like playing tennis without a net. And I think that's really indicative of something about Frost's own poetic vocation, in that he doesn't see it as something he's at liberty to invent. It's something he inherits. The rules of the game are something that he inherits. And whatever freedom he has, well, we could liken to that freedom to something that another poet, John Ashbery, says when he says what he likes about writing in non-free verse. He says it's like when you're a kid and you're going down a hill on your bike and the pedals are going really fast. And so the rhythm is actually about this negotiation between your feet and the law of the pedal, if you like.
That's great.
And that goes really deep in Frost. So there is that sense of craft that in his mind, I imagine, would link what he's doing to what a cabinet maker is doing, for instance. And it takes us back to the original meaning of poema as making and the poet as a maker. So I think we have to remember that with Frost in particular and his own sense of vocation.
Yeah, no, that's very nice. It's something I meant to mention at the beginning. I think there's a right after that use of the phrase that was new to me, giving a loose my soul. He says, that day, giving a loose my soul, I spent on the unimportant wood. So he makes explicit that the wood is unimportant, but the chopping of it is anything but. The chopping of it brings all this stuff out and to a head. Yeah, that's very nice. Okay, look, here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to just say a couple of things about this absolutely, to me, when I was going through it these last 2-3 weeks, gripping poem, An Ordinary Evening in New Haven, by Stevens, and just say a couple of things about how themes that have come up from this poem are absolutely at the center of Stevens's interest in that poem and in perhaps his whole poetic oeuvre. So it's called An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. And the first line simply reads, the eye's plain version is a thing apart, comma. We don't need to go further than that to see this is about what it is to be ordinary, what an ordinary evening is, and what it is to be plain, the I's plain version. Starting with the second one, just, call to mind how sort of chameleon-like the notion of plain is. It can be very positive, the plain truth. It can be negative, plain Jane, not pretty, right? This poem is in many ways, about the I's plain version is anything but, and what it is and how we're going to get at it. Ordinary too actually can be neutral and ordinary, as it were, not necessarily at the expense of being something positive. Something that Stevens would have known. He's very well read, and he's a deeply philosophical poet. In the Latin sense of ordinarius, it's actually a positive, and it contrasts with extraordinarius in exactly the opposite way that in English, ordinary and extraordinary work. In English, extraordinary is remarkable, right? For writing a letter of recommendation, you don't have to say, Benicia is a very ordinary student. No, you say she's an extraordinary student, of course, true, right? In German academic life, a professor ordinarius, the literally ordinary professor, is the regular one. Ordain, order, is at the root of ordinary. And the ordinary professor has, as it were, the real job. And if you want somebody else, and there's not really room, you make them an extraordinary professor. But the extra there means just kind of by the side. So it's kind of opposite to the way we do it. Okay, so brief comments on the man on the dump before Manisha reads it, and then we'll do the same thing. It's a much more difficult poem. I just urge everybody to see what remains with them from it. I came across it completely by the way sort of way. A book that I read in the summer that I've certainly found it worthy enough to recommend it to all and sundry, and have done. It's called Lands of Lost Borders, Out of Bounds on the Silk Road. Mostly a kind of meditative memoir of the author Kate Harrison, a good friend, bicycling from Istanbul to India, and it's pretty remarkable. She's talking about her childhood fascination with space travel. And she says when she heard of the Voyager space missions, she says, I would have jumped at the chance to hitch a ride on either of the Voyagers, their lack of life support systems notwithstanding. Of course, I would ache for family and friends, setting off for some faraway place with no escape route or ticket home. I'd miss my books and my mother and even the sheep shed. But it was the truth I was after, the deepest wonder, nothing less. Wrote Wallace Stevens in a poem I read years later. I was grateful someone had finally managed to articulate it. I didn't know the poem, and I fancied myself something of a Wallace Stevens fan, so I was fascinated to then go to it, and I certainly still find it enormously difficult to interpret. And I'll just maybe say one last thing, that as I look at it, and as I was thinking of my experience of the frost, I'm tempted to say that one way to read the poem is if the frost was building to that climactic last stanza, Stevens is going 6 ways to Tuesday all around the houses to build to that last line. Where was it one first heard of the truth? But Manisha, why don't you read the poem, and then if we have I don't know if you have the text as well, and then we'll do the same thing, and that's probably going to bring us, yeah.
Perfect. All right. The Man on the Dump by Wallace Stevens. Day creeps down, the moon is creeping up. The sun is a corbeil of flowers, the moon blanche. Places there a bouquet, ho-ho. The dump is full of images. Days pass like papers from a press. The bouquets come here in the papers, so the sun and so the moon both come, and the janitor's poems of every day, the wrapper on the cans of pears, the cat in the paper bag, the corset, the box from Estonia, the tiger chest for tea. The freshness of night has been fresh a long time. The freshness of morning, the blowing of day, one says that it puffs as Cornelius Nepos reads. It puffs more than, less than, or it puffs like this or that. The green smacks in the eye. The dew in the green smacks like a fresh water in a can, like the sea. On a coconut, how many men have copied dew for buttons? How many women have covered themselves with dew? Dew dresses, stones and chains of dew, heads of the floweriest flowers dewed with the dewiest dew. One grows to hate these things, except on the dump. Now, in the time of spring, azaleas, trilliums, myrtle, viburnums, daffodils, blue phlox. Between that disgust and this, between the things that are on the dump, azaleas and so on, and those that will be, azaleas and so on, one feels the purifying change. One rejects the trash. That's the moment when the moon creeps up to the bubbling of bassoons. That's the time one looks up at the elephant colorings of tires. Everything is shed, and the moon comes up as the moon. All its images are in the dump, and you see as a man, not like the image of a man, you see the moon rise in the empty sky. One sits and beats an old tin can, lard pail. One beats and beats for that which one believes. That's what one wants to get near. Could it after all be merely oneself, as superior as the ear to a crow's voice? Did the nightingale torture the ear, peck the heart, and scratch the mind? And does the ear solace itself in peevish birds? Is it peace? Is it a philosopher's honeymoon one finds on the dump? Is it to sit among mattresses of the dead, bottles, pots, shoes, and grass, and murmur, Aptus Steve? Is it to hear the bladder of grackles and say, invisible priest? Is it to eject, to pull the day to pieces and cry, stanza my stone? Where was it one first heard of the truth? The.
Thank you, Manisha. Okay, so you'll send people into the breakout room again, and then we'll try and make some head or tail of this.
Sorry, I was just having dinner. I don't know if I'll be able to relay the information back that we had talked about as nicely as it was probably spoken in our group, but I think some of the parts that we focused on were kind of how it seems like as the time goes by, there are certain themes that change, whereas there are themes, but they seem to be very similar as the time is changing. So there's like the recycling of day to night, or
yeah,
it was mentioned like the dump is full of images and days pass like papers from a press, but also that there are things that stay the same, like that the flowers will always be there. And then I guess one of the other things we talked about was how specific to the flowers is that they're traditionally seen as beautiful, and that that they don't mind being present in a dump. Like it doesn't matter to them that they exist in a place traditionally seen as less than.
Yeah. Great, good. I love that the recycling. I don't think it was really a concept in the whenever 70, 80 years ago when he wrote the poem, but it's entirely apropos. Good. Next group? Or anybody else?
I don't mind speaking for our group. So we talked a lot about settings. We talked a lot about the dump. And one of the interesting things about the dump is that it's a collection of lives, but it's also a collection of decontextualized objects. So you get these things like lard pails, and you get these things like corsets and tiger chests, and you're able to thread ideas and you're able to thread meaning through them. So when you're thinking about this like arts and science, when you take away those barriers and when you put those walls down a little bit, you're able to kind of get that cross-pollination and get thinking about meaning and that the dump allows you to think about. And one thing that Dr. Jablonski, I think, brought up and was really quite apt was medicine has a dump. We have ideas that we don't use anymore and we put them aside, but still we learn from them and we take them with us and they inform our practice to this day. So that's kind of was our vague reading of the text.
Okay, wonderful. Recycling, decontextualized objects, threading meaning. Wonderful. Last group.
So I will start, but I did again want to have the other two members of the group add their comments. I think we initially thought it was a kind of poem we'd like to read more than once. It's difficult to sometimes integrate it in such a short time, and there's so many pieces of it that stand out and would be wonderful to be able to discuss in more detail. But it was really, I think, that sense of what our perceptions of a dump are and what our perceptions might be of the man who's on the dump and how we might look at someone from the outside. Many of us just drive by dumps. We never stop by them unless we have to drop something off there. And the idea that somehow this man was finding some meaning in being there. We talked about noticing and this idea about noticing what you notice, but also noticing what you don't notice. Particularly as he started looking at it in a different way, he began to see things differently. The phrase, that he began to see the azaleas instead of a lot of things that we might call trash. Then all of a sudden there was some beauty that he was seeing in this place that normally would not be considered beautiful, and wanting to reject it as trash, and then beginning to hear bubbling bassoons and elephant coverings of tires. There was such a vivid imagery that he brought into the piece that just began to give it a whole new way of thinking about what it's like to be in the dump. And then I think, as we thought more about it, it was more about, is it the azaleas sort of was a theme that seemed to be there, that they're there now and they will be there again later, or will that perhaps in a way that we all end up in the same place. Is it that we too, like the azaleas, might eventually be there as well, and what that would mean, and a little bit too about this idea about images on the dump versus actually what the moon is. So the moon comes up as the moon as opposed to its images in the dump, or you see as the man is, not like an image of a man. So it began to become more authentic, more real, more being in the moment, perhaps. But that's a very kind of brief overview. Suzanne and Ibuku, did you want to add anything, please?
No, thank you, Cheryl. I think you summarized it well, and I just expand on that one little thing when we were talking about the azaleas, how all these things, material things that have all these different uses, and some of them are beautiful, but yet that idea, kind of the mortality of, at the end, it didn't matter what you were used for, and it's all in the same place. And we all, not to say that humans are trash,
No.
but I don't know, I really felt this of everything returning to the earth.
Yeah.
And out, I don't want to say outliving our usefulness. Sitting on the dump, still saw beauty in those things.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So look, I think this. I want to make a comment right away about the medical point that was made, because I think the notion of outdated ideas and theories does, I think, bring up an important contrast. Nothing like a tension, but a contrast between the way science works and the way poetry works. The great Canadian critic Northrop Frye says that science and the pursuit of knowledge give us progress. We take what we know and we go further. Literature gives us the classic. The idea that we somehow are going to outdo or go further than Shakespeare, Homer, Goethe is, at any rate, it's not anything like incremental. I mean, the Frost, it's wonderful to have the Frost, right? We have a major American poet saying the experiments with freeing oneself from the shackle of iambic pentameter, rhyming couplets, ABBA, or whatever. It's serious contention. So I think that's an interesting point, and something that I'm kind of embarrassed that I hadn't seen it before. But on this very elementary notion of what's important. Well, a dump is by definition what's not important. That's the whole point of it, right? So we have a poem taking place there in a very weird way. Final point that came to me about the flowers, and then I think I want to just read that stanza and see if people have further thoughts. But about death, right? Well, what's a hackneyed idiom for death? Pushing up the daisies, right? But let's see if I completely agree. It's almost unfair to demand a discussion on first read of this. But let me return to right now in the time of spring, especially because we had spring in the other poem too, right? So interesting, right? Now in the time of spring, azaleas, trilliums, myrtle, viburnums, daffodils, blue phlox, between that disgust and this, between the things that are on the dump, brackets, azaleas and so on, and those that will be, azaleas and so on, one feels the purifying change. One rejects the trash. What's that? There's something odd about the invocation of spring in the first line and that repeated azaleas and so on, isn't there? How might we describe that, Andy? Are you muted? Yeah, you're muted. Can't hear you.
I have a couple of thoughts in response to what you said, Mark. One of which is that it really does seem to bring to that stanza, which stuck out for me as well, brings Stephen's poem close to Frost in some way. Mm-hmm. I mean, the purifying change that Stephen refers to is, in a way, I think in the Frost poem, the change that the speaker in the poem undergoes in the context of seasonal transformation, right? And this kind of liminal moment where we're not in one season and we're not quite in the other.
Yeah.
But where there is this sense that we're situated in a kind of cyclical rhythm of creation and degeneration. The whole kind of Heraclitean bag of tricks. But in both, in the Frost poem, the purifying change, the external seasonal transformation obviously has a kind of subjective correlative. It's less clear to me that that's the case in the Stevens poem.
Yeah, I think I think the way I'd put it now is Stevens is sort of struggling. He's giving voice to a real kind of I'll throw it out there in a medical context, as it were, almost a bipolar reaction we can have to the cycle of the seasons, and spring, the one that's bringing all this new life. There's a traditional, as it were, manic, everything's going crazy and there's sex all over the place and nature's regenerating itself. But what I wrote in the margins between the other two lines is same old, same old. Right. Surely that's the sense he's evoking there.
But also this one word that sticks out for me in that stanza, disgust.
Yes, and that disgust in this, what
the too muchness of it all, right? Like
yeah. No, I think so. I think that's helpful. What do we were?
I add one thing.
Yeah.
One thing that I get fixated on with this poem is the title, "The Man on the Dump," and trying to figure out if this is a reflection of the man on the dump from an outsider's perspective, or if it's the man on the dump reflecting himself, or a combination of the two. And I think that stanza for me, with talking about spring and the flowers, is almost as if I read it at times when I read this poem as this is sort of the outsider's perspective of seeing this man living on a dump, and we have this almost need or desire to contextualize it into something beautiful, to attribute meaning to that circumstance, to figure out what that means, a man on the dump. And as we continue to do that, there's some redundancy to that whole concept of having to attribute meaning to this seemingly paradoxical situation of a man on a dump. And I think that depending on how you read any of the stanzas, trying to read it from the man himself's perspective versus an outsider really changes how the meaning comes out.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I guess, yeah. I find it hard not to read the last stanza, "One sits and beats an old tin can," as first personal, or we, right? But the title is certainly third personal. The man, it's not just on the dump, it's the man on the dump. Yeah, I mean, I'll, you know, I'm far from, you know, having as rich and deep a reading of this as I would like. The bassoons were mentioned, right? And so let me just turn to that, and jump, you know, from the bassoons to the old tin can lard pail. That's the moment when the moon creeps up to the bubbling of bassoons. I think it's hard to see that not as almost bitter, you know, at best ruefully comic. Bassoons are a classic kind of comic sounding instrument, that low thing, and so notice again we have, you know, the moon creeping up could be an occasion for a great oratorical poetic flourish. We have these bassoons, and then, and I know I'm skipping stuff, but then "One sits and beats an old tin can lard pail," when beats and beats, that I mean, I was inspired somewhat by by a remark of Harold Bloom's, that I can actually read much more positively. That's sort of like the blues. That's like elemental music, right? It's not a fancy orchestra. We're just sitting on the dump, beating an old tin can. I was listening to some Robert Johnson beforehand. So I'd like that sort of juxtaposition. And I guess now that I say that, something that I expect Bloom would agree with, one can read then the bassoons as a great European orchestra, but it's being put in a kind of comic register, and one can then think of the dump as the dead, the great poems that have been written, and one can think of the very simple blues rhythms and beating on an old tin can as the attempt to make something American and new out of it.
That strikes me as right, and something that's characteristic of the American tradition, from Emerson to the Adamic vision, as the critic of American literature Joseph Riddell called it, right? To see like that first man. Mm-hmm. The guy beating the tin can is the kind of musical equivalent of that, or it seems right to me that he's the kind of musical equivalent of that first man, right? But yeah. Mark, there's something else that I wanted to bring up too, and that this image of the moon creeping up, which attends the bubbling of bassoons, it repeats. The moon creeps up in the first line as well. And there, very curiously, it suggests that it gives rise to the sun as its image. It places the sun there. What do you make of that?
Yeah.
And then both the repetition and this strange image of the sun as a kind of epiphenomenon of the moon.
Yeah, no, I think that's a nice observation. The moon places the bouquet, but then that's of course a trick of perspective, right? Yeah, I mean it. Images of right, seeing by the light of the moon. At least makes the situation on the dump even weirder, doesn't it? Right? I mean, yeah. It's one thing to be hanging out and sitting on the dump at all. To be doing it in the right at dusk is very strange indeed.
But also to kind of overturn the kind of solarist prejudice of Western thought, from Plato's intelligible sun forward, and say, no, it's the moon that actually makes it all happen. Is a strange move, especially when the moon is associated with appearances, right?
Yeah.
As if to say, well, it's actually the look of things that kind of makes it all. That's where the real is. That's where the is.
Yeah. Yes, I think.
No? I don't know. But...
I think that's a powerful idea. So I can, return to the something I left out of the dissolving the presumed separation between the arts associated with emotion and creative freedom, and the sciences, rationality, bifurcated systems. Right, so creative power, right? Where does it come from? At all, in the first place, from the ground up. The analogy might be the sun. But here, if we're not actually identifying, for example, God as the ultimate creator, the source of all creativity, then all we have is the reflection. And we can sort of know that somehow the moon couldn't do it all on its own, but we don't have access, so to speak, to the actual thing that's doing it. It's this this ultimate mystery, this question. This is good. Let me
invisible priest.
Nice. Yeah. No, there that it fits that nicely. And yeah, I mean, we're almost at the hour. So the ordinary evening New Haven, after the line I read, I'll just read a few more lines and I think you'll see the connection. The eyes plain version is a thing apart, the vulgate of experience. Of this, a few words, and yet, and yet, and yet, as part of the never-ending meditation, part of the question that is a giant himself. And the giant question then could be, where does creativity come from? What's its ultimate source? Something like that. Good. Is that, I mean, we don't want to prey on people's patience, right, Manisha? We need to.
Sure, we can, if there's anything you wanted to say in closing, or we can take a couple questions if there's any, and then I can just say a few words at the very end here.
Yeah, you should close it off. I thank you, Ted, for your various comments in the chat, and I wish we'd had more time to talk about your angle on the frost. Yeah, I think all I want to say again is thanks so much, and I'm so glad that Andy Payne could make it. It's a nice use of this situation we're in. I mean, you guys would have a better time all together, but on the other hand, it makes it possible for people far afield to join in, and I really thought it was a productive discussion. I'm much more appreciative of the two poems than I was before, and that's exactly what I'd hoped for.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. As always, it's such a pleasure, and I really appreciate everyone taking some time out of their evening. I know it's quite late for some people on the eastern side here. You have you'll get an email in a couple moments here. I sent something out. We like to get feedback after every workshop to see if there's anything we can do to improve. And also you can attach any questions you might have for Dr. Migotti on there as well. And I also attached all the links of things we discussed today, as well as just some information about recording. I record these every time we have them. So if you have any issues with your video being in, I usually crop everyone's videos out, but if you have any problems even with the audio from discussions, just shoot me an email and let me know. But I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Thank you so much, and take care.